It was one of those days at work when I could feel the pressure mounting, the desire for more, and yet the overwhelming realization that the corporate world isn't always fair. I had been working at the company for over 5 years, climbing the ladder slowly but surely. I was diligent, ambitious, and I knew I had earned a promotion. But there was always someone else, always someone who seemed to get there before me, and now my chance seemed closer than ever. But there was a catch in the form of my boss, Mr. Hendrik. He was 30, charismatic, and exuded a certain energy that was hard to describe, but even harder to ignore. Mr. Hendrik was the kind of man who commanded attention without even trying. There was something about the way he looked at me during meetings, something about the way his eyes would linger just a little longer than necessary. I wasn't oblivious to it. In fact, it had been happening for months now. The looks, the compliments, the subtle touches on my shoulder as he passed by, the way he said my name softly, almost in a whisper. But I had always told myself that it was nothing, that it was all in my head. Then one day, after a particularly stressful day at work, Mr. Hendrik called me into his office. His tone was casual, but the look in his eyes told me this was anything but a regular meeting. I walked in, heart racing, feeling a mixture of excitement and anxiety. He motioned for me to sit down, and as I did, I couldn't help but notice the way his gaze traveled over me, taking in every inch of my body. There was something electric in the air, a tension that was palpable. "Cassie," he began, his voice low and smooth, "you've been doing exceptional work lately. I've noticed, and I think it's time we talked about your future here." This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. But there was something about the way he said it, something about the way he leaned forward slightly that made me realize this wasn't going to be a straightforward conversation. "You know," he continued, his eyes never leaving mine, "in this business it's not just about hard work. It's about relationships, connections. You know what I mean?" I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "I see a lot of potential in you, Cassie, and I think you could go far, very far." But his voice trailed off, and he stood up, walking around his desk to stand next to me. I could feel the warmth of his body close to mine, the scent of his cologne filling the air. "But," I whispered, barely able to speak. He leaned down, his lips dangerously close to my ear. "But sometimes, to get where you want to go, you have to be willing to give a little, to take risks, to let go of your inhibitions." His hand brushed against my shoulder, his touch gentle, but I knew what he was suggesting. I knew exactly where this was headed, and yet, there was a part of me, an undeniable part, that was intrigued, excited even. I had always been drawn to him, to his power, to the way he made me feel when he was near. "Are you willing to take that risk, Cassie?" His voice was barely a whisper now, his hand moving slowly down my arm. I turned to face him, my eyes meeting his. There was no turning back now. The tension between us was too strong, too intense to ignore. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He smiled a slow, seductive smile that sent my heart racing. "Good," he said softly. "Very, very good." I was sitting there, trying to process everything, and the next thing I knew, he was kissing me. His lips were firm, insistent, and I found myself melting into him, into the heat of his body. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer as I wrapped my arms around his neck. It was as if all the tension, all the unspoken desire between us had finally reached its breaking point. I could feel the heat rising between us, the urgency of his touch as his hands roamed over my body, exploring every curve. His kisses were deep, hungry, and I found myself responding in kind, my body aching for more. There was something intoxicating about the way he touched me, the way he made me feel desired, wanted. It was as if the rest of the world had disappeared, and all that mattered was this moment, this connection between us. He lifted me onto his desk, his hands sliding up my thighs as he kissed me with a passion that took my breath away. I could feel the hardness of his desire pressing against me, and I moaned softly. the sound escaping my lips before I could stop it. His hands were everywhere, exploring, teasing, driving me wild with need. I had never felt anything like this before, never felt such an overwhelming desire, such a burning need for someone. And yet, there was something more than just lust in the air. There was an undeniable chemistry between us, a connection that went beyond the physical. I could feel it in the way he looked at me, in the way he touched me. It was as if we had been waiting for this moment, as if all the tension, all the desire had been building up for this. He pulled back slightly, his breathing heavy as he looked down at me, his eyes dark with desire. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low and husky. I nodded, my heart racing. "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible. This was all the confirmation he needed. He kissed me again, harder this time, his hands moving to unbutton my blouse, his fingers brushing against my skin, sending shivers down my spine. I moaned softly, arching my back as he kissed his way down my neck, his lips leaving a trail of fire in their wake. The next few minutes felt like an eternity, a whirlwind of passion and desire as we gave into the moment, to the overwhelming need that had been building between us for so long. I was laying on his desk, legs wide open, and with one strong push, he entered me. I moaned with pain and pleasure. His hand was on my neck, choking me, and he was moving fast and hard, doing everything he could to ruin me for the promotion. There was no going back now. This was happening, and I couldn't stop it, even if I wanted to. After what felt like hours, we finally pulled away from each other, both of us breathing heavily, our bodies still trembling from the intensity of the moment. He looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Desire, yes, but also something deeper, something more. "Cassie," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion, "I've wanted this for so long. You have no idea." I looked up at him, my heart still racing. "Me too," I whispered, barely able to believe that this had actually happened. He smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made my heart skip a beat. "I'm going to make sure you get that promotion, Cassie. You deserve it." His words echoed in my mind as I stood there, still breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. "You deserve it," he had said. And yet, it wasn't just about the promotion anymore. It felt like so much more had been promised in that moment, an unspoken understanding between us. As I looked into his eyes, I saw something deeper, something that stirred the emotions I had tried so hard to suppress. The silence in the room felt thick, heavy with the intensity of what had just happened. But it was his gaze that anchored me, holding me captive in a way I couldn't resist. He took a step closer, brushing a loose strand of hair from my face. His touch was gentle, yet commanding, as though he was marking a boundary neither of us had ever dared to cross before. "Cassie," he said, my name rolling off his lips with a softness. "This doesn't have to end here." I felt my breath hitch, my lips parting slightly, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to process the storm of emotions raging inside me. His eyes were piercing, filled with a hunger that made me feel both nervous and exhilarated at the same time. I had never seen him like this, vulnerable, exposed, yet still so overwhelmingly powerful. "I don't want it to," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But the honesty of the words hung in the air between us. A slow smile crept onto his lips, his hand moving to cup my cheek as he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine once more, softer this time. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't desperate, it was deliberate, teasing, as if he wanted to savor every moment, every sensation. I could feel the tension in his body, the way he was holding back, waiting for me to give him the signal, to let him know this was what I wanted too. I kissed him back, my hand slipping around his neck as I pulled him closer, feeling the warmth of his body against mine. The soft hum of his approval vibrated through me, and I knew at that moment that we were crossing a line we could never uncross. But I didn't care. I wanted it. I wanted him. As our kisses deepened, I could feel the heat rising again, the same fiery passion that had overtaken us before. His hands moved down my back, pulling me even closer until there was no space left between us. His body was solid, strong, and every touch, every caress made me crave more. The tension was building again, and it was almost unbearable. God, Cassie. His voice was ragged, full of desire, his breath hot against my skin as he trailed kisses down my neck. You have no idea what you do to me. I could feel the control slipping from both of us as his hands explored my body, his fingers sliding under the helm of my blouse, his touch setting my skin on fire. I leaned into him, my own hands running down his chest, feeling the firm muscles beneath his shirt. The strength that I had always admired from afar, now something I could touch, feel, and experience for myself. He lifted me effortlessly, placing me with my back against the wall, his body pressed against mine as he continued to kiss me, harder, deeper. The air between us crackled with an almost unbearable intensity, and I could feel the walls of professionalism we had built over the years crumbling around us. We weren't boss and employee anymore. We were just two people, caught in the throes of something we could no longer deny. His hand slid up my thigh, his touch slow, deliberate, sending waves of pleasure through me. "Is this what you want?" he asked, his voice low and husky, filled with an intensity that made my heart race. "Yes," I breathed, my voice trembling with anticipation. His hands moved with purpose now, as though every second counted. The urgency returned, but it wasn't rushed. It was precise, calculated, and I found myself lost in the way he made me feel. He started pleasing me with his two fingers, and I was all wet like a waterfall. Every inch of my skin that he touched, every soft kiss he placed, sent waves of pleasure through my body. It was overwhelming, intoxicating, and I wanted more. I needed more. He pulled back for a moment, just enough to look into my eyes, his breathing heavy, his thumb brushed over my bottom lip, his eyes dark with desire. "I've wanted this for so long, Cassie," he admitted, his voice raw. "You don't know how many times I've thought about this, about you. You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice full of awe. "So damn beautiful." I blushed, my heart fluttering at the sincerity in his words. It wasn't just about lust anymore. There was something more happening between us, something neither of us had planned for, but it was there, undeniable and real. He kissed me again, harder this time, his hands exploring every inch of my skin as we lost ourselves in the moment. The passion between us was relentless, growing with every touch, every kiss, until it felt like we were both on the edge of something we couldn't control. His hands gripped my hips, pulling me closer to him, and I could feel the heat of his body, the strength of his desire, pressing against me. "Cassie," he murmured against my lips, his voice full of urgency, "I need you." Every kiss, and it only made me want him more. "Then take me," I whispered, my voice trembling with anticipation. That was all it took. He kissed me fiercely, and I held his rod now. I was on my knees now, sucking it like a lollipop. He was saying my name again and again until he released his liquid all over my face. And at that moment, as we gave in to the passion between us, I realized that this was just the beginning of something that neither of us had planned for, but something that we both wanted more than anything. He pulled away slightly, his expression serious now, though his eyes still held that same warmth, that same desire. "We need to talk," he said gently, his hand still resting on my waist. I nodded, but I said I would be back in a few minutes. I washed my face and came back with a sudden awareness of what was to come. "I know," he sighed, running a hand through his hair, clearly searching for the right words. "I've wanted you for so long, Cassie, more than I ever thought I should. And now, I don't want this to just be something that happens once and we move on. I want more." I wanted to believe him, I wanted to believe that we could make this work, that the lines between work and personal life could blur without consequence. But deep down, I knew that wasn't how the world worked. People would talk, rumors would spread, and our relationship, whatever it was, would always be under scrutiny. "I don't want to lose my job," I whispered, the fear finally spilling out. He leaned in, kissing me softly on the forehead. "You won't, I promise." The sincerity in his voice was comforting, but the doubts still lingered. I looked up at him, searching his eyes for something, reassurance, a sign that everything would be okay. And at that moment, I saw it, the truth. He meant every word. He was willing to take the risk, to fight for what we had started. And suddenly, I realized that I was too. I took a deep breath, letting the fear slip away, replaced by a quiet resolve. "Okay," I said softly. "Let's figure this out together." His smile was warm, filled with relief and something that looked a lot like hope. He pulled me into his arms again, holding me close, and for the first time, I felt a sense of peace. Whatever happened next, we would face it together. As we stood there in his office, the chaos of the outside world forgotten for a moment, I knew that this wasn't just about a promotion anymore. This was about us. And no matter how complicated things might get, no matter what challenges lay ahead, I was ready to take that risk. Because for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be, and that was with him.